What was noteworthy was a rare opportunity to sit down with
Yeah.
Kevin Cheveldayoff. I had joked with how well the Jets have played so far this year and where they are in the standings that you guys would have been sitting around, and then the music would hit and Chevy would walk in with the Vince McMahon strut saying, "What are we talking about?" Obviously, I'm joking, but it has been a great first half of the season, despite
Yeah.
the way it ended in Detroit last week. Tell us a little bit about this conversation. And listen, I know you've had many of them because Kevin Cheveldayoff's been around for a while. This is something that happens every year around this time. How would you describe it? And was it different at all than previous years?
I wouldn't say different. I mean, if there's one critique of Cheveldayoff, the speaker, it's, he's great at saying a lot, but saying very little. But, I think what was important yesterday and what I think fans wanted to hear was if the Jets are in a position in a month or 2 months' time, a month and a half now, he said they're going to go for it. His words were seize the moment. If the opportunity is there, that they want to take that opportunity. I think if you're reading between the lines, if you listen to, I mean, there was only three of us there. We sat down with him for almost 35 minutes yesterday, and you read between the lines, and I think there's a large part of the 2017-18 season, and then they go into that. Okay, so you try and seize the moment that year, you didn't, but you wanted to seize the moment the next year with essentially the same club, and that team was the best team in the league at Christmas, and then we all know the rest of that story. Just didn't seize that moment. And I think, from talking to Kevin Cheveldayoff yesterday, it really sounded like, they know where the opportunity is. They see it now. They know that the players want the team to seize the moment as well, because, you never know when you're going to get back here. And this is the thing, right? This is the best team record-wise the Jets have since that 2017-18 season. There's a lot of parallels in terms of, how they're playing, how Connor Hellebuyck is playing, the penalty kill, all that sort of stuff. So if this is the year and they make it through, January is not an easy month, obviously, just given their schedule, it's just as condensed. But if they can get through this month, get the week off and still be ahead of the game, they'll be right there fighting still for first place. And at that point, the West is wide open, right? I mean, if you look at it, it's pretty much Winnipeg, Vegas, and then who knows what, right? Like if you look at, and Dallas, of course, shouldn't forget Dallas, but look where the Colorado Avalanche are. They're not in a playoff spot. The last I checked, I think they're still 10 points behind the Winnipeg Jets in the Central. So here's your chance. If seize the moment becomes a new hashtag and whatever and all that kind of stuff, yeah, I mean,
well, from a GM's
go for it, right?
From a GM's perspective,
yeah.
Like, I don't really see 2019 as any different than 2018, other than they'd done the same thing the year before. I mean, they went and they got Paul Stastny, and that worked out well.
Right.
I mean, I would almost argue they were more aggressive in 2019 from a GM's perspective, going and getting Kevin Hayes and the other guys. There was a number of players that sort of came in, and it didn't work for the club. And the one thing I'll say, listen, we are as guilty of this as fans. I mean, we always talk about what could happen. I mean, they're fun hockey conversations that happen in these sort of formats.
Yeah.
But you'd be hard-pressed to go and show all of those trade deadline deals, how many of them actually really, truly help the club, certainly put them over the top. And it often comes at far greater a cost when you look at what happened afterwards. And, one of the things that I'll give them credit for throughout this period of all the injuries, where not jumping on, and as he mentioned, I was watching what he had to say with Sarah.
Yeah.
The other GMs aren't always giving you a lifeline. Sometimes they're giving you an anchor and trying to take a problem off of their hands. But in a lot of ways, it is the core of your group that is going to be what makes or breaks your season. Can you make the team better? Can you make some additions that can help you get over that hump? For sure. But right now, and I mean, it really goes right down the middle, from Connor Hellebuyck to Josh Morrissey to the three guys playing in the middle, and Lowry, Scheifele, and Dubois. That, so I'm not ignoring Kyle Connor or any of the other guys, but you know what I'm saying? That core of the Winnipeg Jets has gotten them to this point where they sort of do put the onus on the general manager to do everything he can to, in his mind, round out the lineup
Yeah.
But the bottom line is right now, as we sit here at the halfway point of the season, the core of the Winnipeg Jets team, as well as the depth that maybe not a lot of people knew was there before, is the reason why we're sitting here talking about a team sniffing first place.
Agreed. Yeah. And I think if you look at how teams have won Stanley Cups in recent years, it hasn't been adding always that big name piece to do it. As you said, it's largely been about rounding out the roster. What are your needs? Do you need, if you're St. Louis Blue, or if you're the Tampa Bay Lightning and you need to get tougher in the bottom six, you go out and pick up Patrick Maroon, right? If you're the Colorado Avalanche and you need a middle six guy, you go out and get a Terry Lehkonen, and those were the guys that helped them win the game. It didn't upset the core or anything like that. It didn't change anything. It strengthened a part of the roster that just needed a little bit of more oomph. And in both of those cases, when you think about it, and even last year with the Lightning going out and getting Brandon Hagel and Nick Paul, Nick Paul essentially won them the series against the Toronto Maple Leafs that year. So it's always about, it's a crapshoot, right? You don't always know if the guy, Kevin Hayes, the Jets have a perfect example of this. Kevin Hayes was supposed to be the second line center. He ended on the fourth line, right? Sometimes it doesn't always work out, but then you see the Paul Stastnys of the world where he fit in seamlessly. And this is a team that wanted to sign Paul Stastny after that short stint he had with them on to the way to the Western Finals. So, it's difficult to do this. One thing that Kevin Cheveldayoff said yesterday was, they're not afraid to spend. They've shown that in the past. They've spent draft capital. They spent money. But the one thing he said that I thought was interesting is they haven't always dipped into prospect capital, right? Selling prospects. And I think this year, if you're thinking about it, this might be the year where the Jets start throwing out some of their prospects to try and get what they need, right? And that's where you take some of these more bigger swings, right? If you want a Johnny Taves, or if you want a Bo Horvat, or you want if you want to be in the mix for some of these big names come March 3rd, you're not going to be able to just be giving away first rounders or whatever it is. And you might not want to give away first rounders. There's been a lot of talk this year about this 2023 draft class being really deep, and
I completely agree.
Right, and there's even second round picks that teams aren't going to want to trade because you could get a good player fall into that second round still.
Well, and just quickly on that, Scott,
yeah.
I mean, one of the things that we have to think about, and I'm sure Kevin Cheveldayoff does each and every day, is where his team is at and the contract statuses of some of the most important players on the club. And who knows? I mean, nothing can be guaranteed outside of the next 2 seasons. And even next year, I think, is very much up in the air because certainly from my perspective, if Kevin Cheveldayoff knows that he is going to lose a Dubois or a Hellebuck, to lose them for nothing would really be a setback for the franchise. So, I mean, you have to get to the point where you are doing the moves that you think will help you win right now, but not completely mortgaging a future that is still quite bright with everyone in the system. We're going to be talking about to Declan Chisholm a little later on, who's of course the Moose representative for the American Hockey League. And you've got Ville Heinola, you've got Dylan Sandberg, these guys that are having it. Well, Ville right now, being great on the cusp, the bubble, if you will. Logan Stanley's been injured. He'll be back in the mix, presumably, when he's there. I sort of ride with you on that the prospects might be more likely to move than potentially their first-round pick this year because in a couple years when they might need that player to come in, this is the time to do it as well as Rutger McGrory, Chaz Lucius, Brad Lambert. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, that is the next generation of these young Jet players that will maybe be replacing some of the guys that are either finishing up their careers or going elsewhere. One of the things that I heard Cheveldayoff say, and it makes a lot of sense to me, and not as much because of the situation the Jets are in right now, Scott, but more because of the market that they're in, difficulties in getting players in free agency, is that the team might be more interested if they're making deals to get players with term that might be around for longer than a Bo Horvat or a Jonathan Taves that are only signed until the end of the season. Chevy, touch on that at all? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, he wouldn't dive into it. Kevin Cheveldayoff wouldn't dive into exactly his targets, right? We have heard that, Ivan Provorov might be one of those guys. And Ivan Provorov is somebody that they targeted before, way back to the Patrick Laine deal, right? Looking for that defenseman. Ivan Provorov, a defenseman, has struggled in Philly. There seems to be frustration on both sides of the fence there for those guys, both player and club. But he has some term left. I believe he has 2 or 3 years left on his contract after this season. And so, yeah, I mean, this is the thing, right? This team has always wanted to trade for term when they do it, right? If you look at the Brendan Dillon deal or the Nate Schmidt deal, both had term, right? I mean, those are the things that this team likes because you never know. It's hard to re-sign these guys if it works out here. But what are they going to do? Are they going to shove Bo Horvat, $9 million a year when they're trying to, potentially also pay Mark Scheifele, Connor Hellebuck, and potentially even Pierre-Luc Dubois, exorbitant amounts of money to stay here? It's difficult to do that. So if you can get a Provorov, I suppose that works. But yeah, he didn't really talk too much about exactly. I mean, he never does about exactly who they're targeting, or even I even asked him yesterday. If right now, if you had to go buy somebody, where do you see those fits on this team? Where does this team need to get better? And he kind of dodged the question by saying, well, we don't really know right now. I mean, part of the problem is it's January, not March, and you don't know who's going to be injured. Lots can happen in the next 6 weeks, right?
Well, and the team looks a lot different than it did a week ago before
exactly,
all those guys came back.
All these guys back. Exactly, right? So they don't, they're almost relearning what this team at full strength is, what the strengths and weaknesses are of this team, right? I mean, if you think about it, I mean, they haven't had one of their top 6 forwards essentially for 11 weeks, almost the whole first half of the season. Nikolai Ehlers was out. And then, you got the Blake Wheeler injury and Cole Perfetti and Manalainen and all these guys, right? But, again, I think it was really important yesterday what he said. And he even talked about that, about the win now mentality, because you don't know the future. And so Cheveldayoff said, and, you want to be in the moment right now. You want to live in the moment because you don't know what that's going to be. So he talked yesterday about, behind the scenes, his staff has looked at a lot of stuff, looked at different players, all that. But he said, at the front office or, talking to us in the media, it's business as usual right now. So we'll see what happens. Again, there's, if this is the year, I mean, lots of people are thinking, the Jets might make this massive swing for one of these big names players. But at the same time, that might not always necessarily be warranted come the playoffs. Because, the other thing Cheveldayoff said about this year and why the team's been a bit successful is that they could have gone out in the summer and got a player that would have moved Cole Perfetti maybe down the roster or moved Morgan Barron down the roster, but they didn't, right? We criticized him in the summer for maybe having that slow summer, the quiet summer. But, in the end, or at least with hindsight now, you kind of look at that and you're like, okay, well, maybe this was the right decision to just bring in a Sam Gagner and a Saku Manalainen and a Kevin Stenlund and all that, because you wanted your younger players like the Perfettis and the Barons and even the Sandbergs and the Heinelas and that sort of thing to kind of grow and get that opportunity to play. It's a bit of a shift from what we've seen before, right? I mean, this was always a team that brought in veterans to populate the fourth line, and it was different under Paul Maurice. Under Rick Bowness now, it's always been it's been since he got here very much about instilling confidence in young and old. It doesn't matter what the age is or the gap or anything like that. It's always just been about, can you do the job and can I give you the tools to do it? And he's been able to do that with a lot of his players. I mean, look at the guys that are having career years. If we even think, we'll say that Neil Pionk is maybe struggling right now. Neil Pionk's already set his career mark in goals this season, right? So yeah, his defensive game might be taking a bit of a dip. I think he's still battling through something right now, which is part of the problem. But he's on pace through 41 games to double his career high in goals totals, right? So there's been a lot of those types of things with this team that you wonder, are they going to pull a lightning, or are they going to try and take a big swing and try and? So we'll see what Kevin Cheveldayoff has learned from these other teams in recent years, and how they've kind of populated their lineups at the trade deadline and supplemented them going forward to try and make a big, deep playoff push.
Well, it's funny you compare, you kind of use that example of the Lightning last year.
Yeah.
Because I think there's, not to compare the Jets to the Lightning that have been the standard for the NHL and won back-to-back championships, but the move they made, I remember doing the show and go, wait a second, they just traded 2 first-round picks for Hagel?
Yeah.
And then we sort of did a little digging and realized that he's got 2 more years at $1.5 million and fits in perfectly, with their group, with their salary structure, as well as, has a future going forward. And Nick Paul was a guy they brought over at he was, I believe he was a UFA. They signed him afterwards and got him to stay being part of a group. And, he has been there. I think maybe some of those deals, if they are made, certainly if you're talking about trading prospects or picks, those sort of things, it might be more players that have more than just this one season and this one playoff run in them. And that would be a little different than some of the trades that they've made before. But the bottom line is, and I mean, for all the criticism that Cheveldayoff took, I think you got to give him some credit for sticking to his guns, because the one thing that I think he can look anybody in the face and say is the depth of this organization was better than people gave them credit for. And whether it was some of those moves like a Stenlund that came in the summer to no fanfare whatsoever, or other players that have gotten the opportunity to come up and show that they can hang with this club, those are the guys that got them through maybe the most adverse period of this entire season when it comes to the schedule combined with the injuries. And here we are with this team right around first place in the Central at the midway point.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, he has to be given credit for it. I agree with you 100%. I mean, I've said this before. I think a few of us snickered when he said, it was a seismic change to bring in Rick Bowness. And, you look 41 games in and you're like,
he was right.
Yeah. You throw your hands in the air. You're like, I tap, right? Like, you're right. It's true. And that's, the first line, like my lead of my season preview essentially was asking the question of how, we're going to find out how impactful a head coach can be. And we've seen it. I mean, we've seen him. Well, he's whispered to Mark Scheifele, Pierre-Luc Dubois, obviously Josh Morrissey, all these guys, right? He's getting career years out of all of these guys. And he's done it too, where you're right. I mean, I think part of the problem with why we didn't know how deep this club was, though, in terms of their depth, was we never really got to see a lot of them, right? We saw Christian Reichel a little bit last year, and we saw Ville Heinola at times, right? But this team was always more veteran-laden. It's the way Paul Maurice liked it. It was more of a 3-line team instead of a 4-line team. Rick Bowness has wanted to make this a 4-line team because he knows, when he was in Dallas, he needed a 4-line team to get to the Stanley Cup final. And Tampa had a better 4-line team and won that year in the first cup in the bubble that season. So, I think there's been I want to call it an epiphany, because I don't know if that's respectful enough to Kevin Cheveldayoff, but when you're not stuck, when you have the same coach for a long time and that sort of thing, when you're not looking around at what's different out there and that sort of thing, you maybe just forget the fact that the game's evolving and you kind of miss some of that. And this year it seems that this team has kind of decided that it'd be a good idea to start pulling some of the youth in. They talked about draft and develop forever, and yet they weren't really. They were developing and they were drafting, but they weren't really pushing it on to the NHL all the time, except for their first round picks, right? And obviously the Connor Hellbucks in the 5th round and that sort of thing. But you weren't seeing some of these other guys. I mean, Ville Heinola was a first round pick 4 years ago now, coming this June. So yeah, I think there's there's good reason to give Cheveldayoff credit and this team credit for essentially standing pat in the summer and thinking, okay, well, we're getting a new coach. He'll let us know whether what they have is adequate or not, and he's been able to extract some really good things out of this team. That's not to say this team doesn't have a long way to go. Rick Bowness will be the first one to say it. He's not been happy with these last pair of games. One of them was a win, the other one was a loss, but just the way that they've won and lost those games isn't the way that they want to do either, right? But a fresh set of eyes on this team with the talent that they had really changed the complexion of this team, in a half a year, essentially, right?
No, here, and, I mean, it starts with Bones, and everyone's followed the lead.